Hey guys, welcome back to Sleepless Tales. We're reading Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I listened to the first little bit of the last part, and man, I sounded so bored doing that. Truth is, I am bored. This is boring sometimes. Surprise. I saw I saw an article recently of the most desired jobs across countries. In Russia, it's I want to be an astronaut, right? France, it's I want to a diplomat. I don't know, but USA, YouTuber. Kids want to be YouTubers. Y'all suck. Don't you bimbos? Come on. This is literally the worst job. But speaking of meme review, guys, meme review of the week. This week's meme is still, hey, that's kind of true, which I saw from a video like 2 years ago. There's zero context to it. It's just. I don't even know where the sound bites from. I couldn't find it. Just, hey, that's kind of true, or something like that. That meme followed by "I am a child." Right? It's all meaningless. It's all without meaning. Anyways, we're on page 60 something. Let's get into the reading. Sometimes I was positively choked with resentment. At last, I determined to challenge my enemy to a duel. I composed a splendid, charming letter to him, imploring him to apologize to me, and hinting rather plainly at a duel in case of refusal. The letter was so composed that if the officer had had the least understanding of the sublime and beautiful, he would certainly have flung himself on my neck and have offered me his friendship. And how fine that would have been. How we would have got on together. He could have shielded me with his higher rank, while I could have improved his mind with my culture, and well, my ideas and all sorts of things might have happened. Only fancy. This was 2 years after his insult to me, and my challenge would have been a ridiculous anachronism. In spite of all the ingenuity of my letter, disgusting and explaining away the anachronism. But, thank God, to this day I thank the Almighty with tears in my eyes, I did not send the letter to him. Cold shivers run down my back when I think of what might have happened if I had sent it. And all at once, I revenged myself in the simplest way, by a stroke of genius. A brilliant thought suddenly dawned upon me. Sometimes on holidays, I used to stroll along the sunny side of the Nevsky about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Though it was hardly a stroll, so much as a series of innumerable miseries, humiliations, and resentments, but no doubt that was just what I wanted. I used to wriggle along in a most unseemly fashion, like an eel, continually moving aside to make way for generals, for officers, or the guards and the hussars, or for ladies. At such minutes, there used to be a convulsive twinge at my heart, and I used to feel hot all down my back at the mere thought of the wretchedness of my attire, of the wretchedness and abjectness of my little scurrying figure. This was a regular martyrdom, the continual, intolerable humiliation at the thought, which passed into an incessant and direct sensation that I was a mere fly in the eyes of all this world, a nasty, disgusting fly, more intelligent, more highly developed, more refined in feeling than any of them, of course, but a fly that was continually making way for everyone, insulted and injured by everyone. Why I inflicted this torture upon myself, and why I went to the Nevsky, I don't know. I felt simply drawn there at every possible opportunity. Already then I began to experience a rush of the enjoyment of which I spoke of in the first chapter. After my affair with the officer, I felt even more drawn there than before. It was on the Nevsky that I met him most frequently. There I could admire him. He too went there chiefly on holidays. He too turned out of his path for generals and persons of high rank, and he too wriggled between them like an eel. But people like me, not even better dressed than me, he simply walked over. He made straight for them, as though there was nothing but empty space before him, and never, under any circumstances, turned aside. I gloated over my resentment, watching him, and always resentfully made way for him. It exasperated me that even in the street I could not be on, not even on an even footing with him. Why must you invariably be the first to move aside? I kept asking myself in hysterical rage, waking up sometimes at 3 o'clock in the morning, Why is it you and not he? There's no regulation about it. There's no written law. Let the making way be equal, as it usually is when refined people meet. He moves halfway, and you move halfway. You pass with mutual respect. But this never happened, and I always moved aside. Well, he did not even notice my making way for him, and lo and behold, a bright idea dawned upon me. What, I thought, if I meet him and don't move on one side? What if I don't move aside on purpose, even if I knock up upon him? How would that be? This audacious idea took such a hold on me that it gave me no peace. I was dreaming of it continually, horribly, and I purposefully went more frequently to the Nevsky in order to picture more vividly how I should do it when I did do it. I was delighted. This intention seemed to be more and more practical and possible. Of course I shall not really push him, I thought, already more good-natured in my joy. I'll simply not turn aside. I'll run up against him, not very violently, but just shouldering against each other, just as much as decency permits. I'll push against him just as much as he pushes against me. And at last I made up my mind completely. But my preparations took a great deal of time. To begin with, when I carried out my plan, I should need to be looking rather more decent, and so I had to think of my get-up. In case of emergency, if, for instance, there were any sort of public scandal, and the public there is of the most recharge, the Countess walks there, Prince D walks there, all the literary world is there, and I must be well dressed. That inspires respect, and of itself puts us on equal footing in the eyes of society. With this object, I asked for some of my salary in advance, and bought at Turkin's a pair of black gloves and a decent hat. Black gloves seemed to me both more dignified and bon ton than the lemon-colored ones which I had contemplated at first. The color is too gaudy. It looks as though one were trying to be conspicuous, and I did not take the lemon-colored ones. I had got ready, long beforehand, a good shirt with white bone studs. My overcoat was the only thing that held me back. The coat in itself was a very good one. It kept me warm, but it was wadded, and it had a raccoon collar, which was the height of vulgarity. I had to change the collar at any sacrifice, and to have a beaver one, like an officer's. For this purpose, I began visiting the Gossinny Devore, and after several attempts, I pitched upon a piece of cheap German beaver. Though, these German beavers soon grow shabby and look wretched. Yet, at first, they look exceedingly well. I only needed it for the occasion. I asked the prince, and even so, it was too expensive. After thinking it over thoroughly, I decided to sell my raccoon collar. The rest of the money, a considerable sum for me, I decided to borrow from Anton Antonich Sietchkin, my immediate superior, an unassuming person, though grave and judicious. He never lent money to anyone, but I had, on entering his service, been specially recommended to him by an important personage who had got me my berth. I was horribly worried. To borrow from Anton Antonich seemed to me monstrous and shameful. I did not sleep for 2 or 3 nights. Indeed, I did not sleep well at that time. I was in fever. I had a vague sinking at my heart, or else a sudden throbbing. Anton Antonich was surprised at first. Then he frowned. Then he reflected, and did, after all, lend me the money, receiving from me a written authorization to take for my salary a fortnight later the sum that he had lent me. In this way, everything was at last ready. The handsome beaver replaced the mean-looking raccoon, and I began by degrees to get to work. It would never have done to act offhand, at random. The plan had to be carried out skillfully, by degrees. But I must confess that after many efforts I began to despair. We simply could not run into each other. I made every preparation. I was quite determined. It seemed as though we should run into one another directly. And before I knew what I was doing, I stepped aside for him again, and he had passed without noticing me. I even prayed as I approached him that God would grant me determination. One time, I had made up my mind thoroughly, but it ended in my stumbling and falling at his feet, because at the very last instant, when I was 6 inches from him, my courage failed me. He very calmly stepped over me, while I flew on one side like a ball. That night I was ill again, feverish, delirious. And suddenly, it ended most happily. The night before, I had made up my mind not to carry out my fatal plan and to abandon it all. And with that object, I went to the Nevsky for the last time, just to see how I would abandon it all. Suddenly, 3 paces from my enemy, I unexpectedly made up my mind. I closed my eyes, and we ran full tilt, shoulder to shoulder, against one another. I did not budge an inch and passed him on perfectly equal footing. He did not even look around and pretended not to notice it. But he was only pretending. I'm convinced of that. I'm convinced of that to this day. And of course, I got the worst of it. He was stronger, but that was not the point. The point was that I had attained my object. I had kept up my dignity. I had not yielded a step, and had put myself publicly on an equal social footing with him. I returned home feeling that I was fully avenged for everything. I was delighted. I was triumphant and sang Italian arias. Of course, I will not describe to you what happened to me 3 days later. If you have read my first chapter, you can guess for yourself. The officer was afterwards transferred. I have not seen him now for 14 years. What is the dear fellow doing now? Whom is he walking over? Chapter 2. But the period of my dissipation would end, and I always felt very sick afterwards. It was followed by remorse. I tried to drive it away. I felt too sick. By degrees, however, I grew used to that too. I grew used to everything. Or rather, I voluntarily resigned myself to enduring it. But I had a means of escape that reconciled everything. That was to find refuge in the sublime and the beautiful. In dreams, of course. And I was a terrible dreamer. I would dream for 3 months on end. I tucked away in my corner, and you may believe me that at those moments I had no resemblance to the gentleman who, in the perturbation of his chicken heart, put a collar of German beaver on his great coat. And I suddenly became a hero. I would not have admitted my 6-foot lieutenant, even if he had called on me. I could not even picture him before me then. What were my dreams, and how could I satisfy them within myself? It's hard to say now, but at the time, I was satisfied with them. Though, indeed, even now, I am to some extent satisfied with them. Dreams were particularly sweet and vivid after a spell of dissipation. They came with remorse and with tears, with curses and transports. There were moments of such positive intoxication, of such happiness, and there was not the faintest trace of irony within me, on my honor. I had faith, hope, love. I believed blindly at such times that by some miracle, by some external circumstance, all this would suddenly open out, expand, that suddenly a vista of suitable activity, beneficent, good, and above all, ready-made. What sort of activity I had no idea. But the right thing was that it should be all ready for me. It would rise up before me, and I should come out into the light of day, almost riding a white horse and crowned with laurel. Anything but the foremost place I could not conceive for myself, and for that very reason, I quite contentedly occupied the lowest in reality. Either to be a hero or to grovel in the mud. There was nothing between. That was my ruin. For when I was in the mud, I comforted myself with the thought that at other times I was a hero, and the hero was a cloak for the mud. For an ordinary man, it was shameful to defile himself, but a hero was too lofty to be utterly defiled. And so he might defile himself. It's worth noting that these attacks of the sublime and beautiful visited me even during the period of dissipation, and just at the times when I was touching the bottom. They came in separate spurts, as though reminding me of themselves, but did not banish the dissipation by their appearance. On the contrary, they seemed to add a zest to it by contrast, and were only sufficiently present to serve as an appetizing sauce. That sauce was made up of contradictions and sufferings, of agonizing inward analysis, and all these pangs and pinpricks gave a certain piquancy, even a significance to my dissipation. In fact, completely answered the purpose of an appetizing sauce. There was a certain depth of meaning in it, and I could hardly have resigned myself to the simple, vulgar, direct debauchery of a clerk, and have endured all the filthiness of it. What could have allured me about it then, and have drawn me at night into the street? No, I had a lofty way of getting out of it all. And what loving kindness, oh Lord, what loving kindness I felt at times in those dreams of mine, in those flights into the sublime and beautiful. Though it was fantastic love, though it never applied to anything human in reality. Yet, there was so much of this love that one did not feel afterwards even the impulse to apply it in reality. That would have been superfluous. Everything, however, passed satisfactorily by a lazy and fascinating transition to the sphere of art. That is, into the beautiful forms of life, lying ready, largely stolen from the poets and novelists and adapted to all sorts of needs and uses. I, for instance, was triumphant over everyone. Everyone, of course, was in dust and ashes and was forced spontaneously to recognize my superiority, and I forgave them all. I was a poet and a grand gentleman. I fell in love. I came in for countless millions and immediately devoted them to humanity. And at the same time, I confessed before all the people my shameful deeds, which of course were not merely shameful, but had in them much that was sublime and beautiful, something in the Manfred style. Everyone would kiss me and weep. What idiots they would be if they did not. While I should go barefoot and hungry, preaching new ideas and fighting a victorious Austerlitz against obscurantists. Then the band would play a march. Amnesty would be declared. The Pope would agree to retire from Rome to Brazil. Then there would be a ball for the whole of Italy at the Villa Borghese on the shores of Lake Como. Lake Como being for that purpose transferred to the neighborhood of Rome. Then would come a scene in the bushes, and so on, so on, as though you did not know all about it. You'll say it's a vulgar and contemptible to drag all this into public after all the tears and transports which I myself have confessed. But why is it contemptible? Can you imagine that I'm ashamed of it at all, and that it was stupider than anything in your life, gentlemen? And I can assure you that some of these fancies were by no means badly composed. It did not all happen on the shores of Lake Como, and yet you are right. It really is vulgar and contemptible. And most contemptible of it all is that now I'm attempting to justify myself to you. And even more contemptible than that is making this remark now. But that's enough. Or there'll be no end of it. Each step will be more contemptible than the last. I could never stand more than 3 months of dreaming at times, without plunging into irresistible desires to plunge into society. To plunge into society meant to visit my superior at the office, Anton Antonich Syotchlikin. He was the only permanent acquaintance I've had in my life, and I wonder at the fact myself now. But I only went to see him when the phase came over me, and when my dreams had reached such a point of bliss that it became essential at once to embrace my fellows and all mankind, and for that purpose I needed, at least, one human being actually existing. I had to call on Anton Antonich. However, on Tuesday is at-home day, so I had my time for passionate desire to embrace humanity so that it might fall on a Tuesday. This Anton Antonich lived on the 4th story in a house in 5 corners, in 4 low-pitched rooms, one smaller than the other, of a particularly frugal and sallow appearance. He had 2 daughters and their aunt, whom used to pour out the tea. Of the daughters, one was 13 and another 14. They both had snub noses, and I was awfully shy of them because they were always whispering and giggling together. The master of the house usually sat in his study on a leather couch in front of the table with some gray-headed gentleman, usually a colleague from her office or some other department. I never saw more than 2 or 3 visitors there, and always the same. They talked about the excise duty, about the business of the Senate, about salaries, about promotions, about His Excellency, and the best means for pleasing him, and so on. I had the patience to sit like a fool beside these people for 4 hours at a stretch, listening to them without knowledge what to say to them or venturing to say a word. I became stupefied. Several times I felt myself perspiring. I was overcome by a sort of paralysis. But this was pleasant and good for me. On returning home, I deferred for a time my desire to embrace all mankind. I had, however, one other acquaintance of a sort, Simonov, who was an old schoolfellow. I had a number of schoolfellows, indeed, in Petersburg, but I did not associate with them, and even given up nodding to them in the street. I believe I transferred to the apartment I was in simply to avoid their company and to cut off all connection with my hateful childhood. Curses on that school, and all those terrible years of penal servitude. In short, I parted from my schoolfellows as soon as I got out into the world. There were 2 or 3 left to whom I nodded in the street. One was Simonov, who had in no way been distinguished at school. He was of a quiet and equable disposition, but I discovered in him a certain independence of character, and even honesty. I don't suppose that he was particularly stupid. I had at one time some rather soulful moments with him, but these had not lasted long, and had somehow been suddenly clouded over. He was evidently uncomfortable at these reminiscences, and was, I fancy, always afraid that I might take up the same tone again. I suspected that he had an aversion for me, but still I went on going to see him, not being quite certain of it. And so, on one occasion, unable to endure my solitude and knowing that it was a Thursday, Anton Antonitch's door would surely be closed, I thought of Simonov. Climbing up to his 4th story, I was thinking the man disliked me, and that it was a mistake to go and see him. But as it always happened, there were such reflections that impelled me, as though purposefully, to put myself into a false position. I went in. It was almost a year since I'd last seen Simonov. Chapter 3. I found 2 of my old schoolfellows with them. They seemed to be discussing an important matter. All of them took scarcely any notice of my entrance, which was strange, for I had not met them for years. Evidently, they looked upon me as something on the level of a common fly. I had not even been treated like that at school, though they all hated me. I knew, of course, that they must despise me now for my lack of success in the service, and from having let myself sink so low about being dressed badly and so on. Seemed to them a sign of my incapacity and insignificance. But I had not expected such contempt. Simonov was positively surprised at my turning up. Even in old days, he had always seemed surprised at my coming. All this disconcerted me. I sat down, feeling rather miserable, and began listening to what they were saying. They were engaged in warm and earnest conversation about a farewell dinner, which they had wanted to arrange for the next day, to a comrade of theirs called Zherkov, an officer in the army, who was going away to a distant province. This Zherkov had been all the time at school with me, too. I began to hate him particularly in the upper forms. In the lower forms, he had simply been a pretty playful boy whom everybody liked. I had hated him, however, even in the lower forms, just because he was a pretty and playful boy. He was always bad at his lessons and got worse and worse as he went on. However, he left with a good certificate, and he had powerful interests. During his last year at school, he came in for an estate of 200 serfs, and as almost all of us were poor, he took up a swaggering tone among us. He was vulgar in the extreme, but at the same time, he was a good-natured fellow, even in his swaggering. In spite of superficial, fantastic, and sham notions of honor and dignity, All but very few of us positively groveled before Zherkov, and the more so, the more he swaggered. And it was not from any interested motive that they groveled, but simply because he had been favored by the gifts of nature. Moreover, it was, as it were, an accepted idea among us that Zherkov was a specialist in regard to tact and the social graces. This last fact particularly infuriated me. I hated the abrupt, self-confident tone in his voice, his admiration of his own witticisms, which were often frightfully stupid, though he was bold in his language. I hated his handsome but stupid face, for which I would, however, have gladly exchanged my intelligent ones, and the free and easy military manners in fashion in the 40s. I hated the way in which he used to talk of his future conquests of women. He did not venture to begin his attack upon women until he had the epaulets of an officer, and was looking forward to them with impatience, and boasted of the duels he would constantly be fighting. I remember how I, invariably so taciturn, suddenly fastened upon Zherkov, when, one day, talking a leisure moment with his schoolfellows of his future relations with the fair sex, and growing as sportive as a puppy in the sun, he all at once declared that he would not leave a single village girl on his estate unnoticed, that was his droit de seigneur, and that if the peasants dared to protest, he would have them all flogged and double the tax on them. The bearded rascals. Our servile rabble applauded, but I attacked him. Not from compassion for the girls and their fathers, but simply because they were applauding such an insect. I got the better of him on that occasion, but though Zherkov was stupid, he was lively and impudent, and so laughed it off, and in such a way that my victory was not really complete. The laugh was on his side. He got the better of me on several occasions afterwards, but without malice, jestingly, casually. I remained angrily and contentiously silent, and would not answer him. When we left school, he made advances to me, but I did not rebuff them, for I was flattered, and we soon parted, and quite naturally. Afterwards, I heard of his barrack-room success as a lieutenant, and of the fast life he was leading. Then there came other rumors of his successes in the service. By then he had taken to cutting me in the street, and I suspected he was afraid of compromising himself by greeting a personage as insignificant as me. I saw him once in the theater, in the third tier of boxes, and when he was wearing shoulder straps, he was twisting and twirling about, ingratiating himself with the daughters of an ancient general. In 3 years he had gone off considerably, though he was still rather handsome and adroit. One could see by the time he was 30 he would be corpulent. And so it was to the Zherkov that my schoolfellows were going to give dinner on his departure. They'd kept up with him for those 3 years, though, privately, they did not consider themselves on an equal footing with him. I'm convinced of that. Okay, taking a pause, we're on page 81. We'll finish this in the next part. I'll see you then. Have a great night. No, this is Sleepless Tales. Don't forget to like, comment, favorite, subscribe. If you have a thing you'd like read, narrated, put it in the comments. Don't forget. Yep, that's all. Have a great night. Goodbye.